The chill of autumn 1944 lingered in the Atlantic air as the German transport vessel SS Bremen eased its way into Norfolk Naval Base, Virginia. On board was not ordinary cargo. Hidden beneath deck, away from the eyes of curious dockworkers, were 47 German women, prisoners of war who had seized during the Allied thrust through France. Among them were nurses, radio operators, code technicians, and communication experts who had once served in some of Germany's most specialized military units. They were not civilians caught in crossfire. They were trained professionals whose skills could influence the intelligence war still raging across Europe. For years, German propaganda had hammered the idea that America was a clumsy nation of inexperienced civilians, too soft and disorganized to withstand Wehrmacht. Yet, the moment these women set foot in the United States, that myth began to collapse. What awaited them in Norfolk would not only contradict what they had been told, it would shake their confidence in Germany's ability to win the war. Before diving into the events that left these seasoned officers stunned, tell me in the comments below where you're from. Among the women on deck was Ingrid Weber, a 28-year-old signals officer. She had overseen communication for an entire Wehrmacht division during campaign front. Ingrid had seen the relentless Red Army in action and had survived the terror of British bombing raids of Berlin. She thought she had witnessed the worst of war. Yet, as the ship's hold creaked open and blinding sunlight flew in, she faced a scene that unsettled every assumption she carried about the American military. The escort in charge of the transfer was Captain Robert Hayes, a composed and seasoned U.S. naval officer. He had supervised dozens of prisoner exchanges, but never had he been tasked with handling female specialists from Germany's elite communication units. These women were not simply soldiers. They carried within them critical knowledge about German defensive tactics, encrypted systems, and radar operations. Hayes had been instructed to remain firm yet respectful, showing them professional courtesy while also ensuring they saw the true strength. This was psychological warfare wrapped in formality. As Ingrid stepped onto the gangplank, her legs unsteady from weeks at sea, her eyes widened at the panorama unfolding before her. Norfolk's vast shipyard seemed endless. Gigantic cranes loomed above half-finished destroyers. Rows of Liberty ships gleamed in the morning sun. And far in the distance, the massive skeleton of an aircraft carrier stretched across dry docks like some mechanical leviathan. Her mind, trained to calculate and measure, began to tally the number of ships visible at once. But the sheer magnitude exceeded her analyticality. It wasn't just the numbers, it was the pace. Everywhere she looked, workers swarmed with purposeful rhythm, as if the entire city pulsed with industrial urgency. For Ingrid, this was more than a sight. It was a revelation. Everything she had been told, that America lacked the discipline and machinery warfare, crumbled in seconds. Awaiting them on shore were trucks. What struck Ingrid most was not their presence but their condition. The vehicles were immaculate. Clean paint, flawless engines, and gleaming steel components. In contrast, back home, German supply lines patched up machines scavenged from battlefields, kept alive with makeshift repairs. These American trucks spoke of resources so abundant that equipment was not preserved necessary. Inside the trucks, Ingrid glanced at the U.S. soldiers assigned to guard them. Their appearance carried its own message. Crisp uniforms, polished boots, well-fitted gear, abundance. Even their rifles gleamed with proper maintenance. To Ingrid, who had grown used to frayed uniforms and shortages within her division, these small details carried weight. They symbolized a nation not merely fighting a war, but thriving while doing so. The journey from the docks to the processing center spanned about 30 miles. From the covered truck, Ingrid and the other women caught glimpses of the landscape rolling past. Instead of rural emptiness, they saw industrial complexes stretching to the horizon. Enormous smokestacks rose like forests, spewing plumes into the sky. The air throbbed with the rhythm of machines that seemed never to rest. To German eyes, these factories appeared impossible to believe. Propaganda back home had mocked American industry as bloated and inefficient. But what Ingrid saw was relentless productivity, a machine of war that dwarfed Germany's best efforts. Assigned to monitor the prisoners during transport was Lieutenant Mitchell, an Army intelligence man. She listened carefully to the hushed conversations among the women. Skepticism gave way to shock. and soon shock deepened into genuine worry. Ingrid muttered quietly to her prisoner, Anna Kruger, a radar technician who had once helped design Luftwaffe detection systems. If this is real, if they can produce like this, then everything we were told was a lie. Anna, her eyes scanning the endless factories, could only nod grim. Arriving at the prisoner processing facility, the women encountered another surprise. The building was organized, spotless, and stocked with supplies. The Germans, who had grown accustomed to shortages, half expected to see chaos behind the front. Instead, they entered a space run with methodical efficiency. Doctors, clerks, and officers moved briskly, each step suggesting that supplies and equipment were available without restriction. Dr. Elizabeth Crawford, a civilian physician contracted by the U.S. military, began medical inspections. She immediately noticed signs of malnutrition among the women: sunken cheeks, pale skin, and weakened posture that reflected months of scarcity. Their uniforms bore endless patches, and their boots were worn near shreds. To Dr. Crawford, this was more than a medical issue. It was evidence of an army sustained by improvisation rather than proper logistics. Meanwhile, Captain Hayes began preliminary interviews. Ingrid, chosen as spokesperson due to her rank and proficiency in English, responded with practiced precision. Yet Hayes observed how her eyes never rested. They darted constantly, cataloging detailed information, each new observation further eroding the confidence. The true turning point for Ingrid came later during a standard processing step. She was granted access to a telephone to notify the international status as a prisoner of war. For her, the act itself was shocking. In Germany, even high-ranking officers struggled to access international ragdon. Yet here, a captured enemy was casually handed communications. While she waited, Ingrid overheard chatter from the communications room. Snippets of conversation revealed American military operations stretching across continents. References to campaigns in Europe, the Pacific, and Africa came with seamless coordination. For Ingrid, it was terrifying. The Germans had boasted of fighting on multiple fronts, but their resources had always been thin. The Americans, by contrast, seemed to manage global campaigns as if they were routine. That evening, the German women were taken to their temporary quarters. The barracks startled them with unexpected comfort: heated rooms, working lights, and hot water. Ingrid lay on a clean cot, replaying the day's revelations in her mind. The food she had been served was another blow: generous portions of meat, vegetables, bread, and milk. It was more than her own soldiers had eaten in months. That night, Ingrid realized the uncomfortable truth. If America could feed and shelter its enemies better than Germany could sustain its troops, then the war's outcome. The second day of captivity brought revelations that cut even deeper into the German confidence. What they had seen upon landing, endless shipyards, immaculate trucks, and well-fed soldiers, was only the beginning. As they were integrated into the routines of their new environment, the scale of American resources became undeniable. For Ingrid and her companions, every small detail hinted at a terrifying truth: Germany was fighting a war it could no longer win. Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell, the young Army intelligence officer tasked with observing the prisoners, carefully. She knew these women were not ordinary captives. Each was highly trained, disciplined, and technically skilled. They had designed radar systems, repaired encrypted communications, and kept German divisions coordinated fire. If anyone could appreciate the scale of what they were seeing in America, it was them. Sarah understood that their shock carried intelligence value far beyond anything formal interrogation produce. During the first formal intake process, Dr. Elizabeth Crawford completed her medical examinations. What she found only confirmed Allied intelligence about the crumbling state of Germany's war machine. Many of the women suffered from vitamin deficiencies, brittle nails, and thinning hair, clear signs of poor nutrition. Several showed the early stages of fatigue disorders brought on by constant stress and lack of rest. Their uniforms, though once sharp, were patched repeatedly, and their boots told the story of long marches and scarcity. Dr. Crawford had treated American servicemen who complained when rations lacked variety, yet here were German specialists who had endured months of malnutrition. With calm professionalism, she prescribed vitamins and supplements, handing them out as casually as if she were giving candy. To her, it was routine. To the Germans, it was almost nothing. The Americans had so much abundance that life-saving medicine was ordinary. Meanwhile, Captain Robert Hayes conducted preliminary interviews with the women. Ingrid, still serving as spokesperson, answered questions with the rigid precision expected of an officer. But Hayes noticed how her confidence wavered. She would pause, her eyes drifting around the facility, taking in every small piece of evident wealth. Filing cabinets brimming with paper, telephones on every desk, stacks of medical supplies. All of it formed a mosaic. The contrast between scarce and abundance grew starker that afternoon when the women were escorted to quarters. The barracks were nothing luxurious by standards. Rows of simple bunks, neatly arranged personal lockers, and a shared mess hall. Yet, to the Germans, these conditions rivaled home. There was running hot water, and heating that kept the building comfortably warm. Ingrid remembered freezing nights in drafty barracks where officers and soldiers alike had huddled under thin blankets. Here, even prisoners were treated with comfort that German soldiers could dream of. Dinner that night delivered another blow to their morale. Plates of meat, potatoes, vegetables, and bread were served in generous portions, accompanied by milk and coffee. Ingrid, who had spent months rationing watery soup and stale bread, stared at her plate in disbelief. She could not help but compare it to the meager rations issued to frontline troops in Germany, where hunger gnawed at discipline and morale. The idea that a prisoner of war could dine better than an active German officer corps. As the women ate in silence, Sarah Mitchell listened to their quiet changes. Ingrid whispered to Anna Kruger, the radar technician beside her. "If this is what they give prisoners, what do their own soldiers eat?" Anna shook her head slowly, the weight of the question heavy between them. Neither dared answer. Later that evening, Sarah Mitchell began her first series of intelligence interviews. Officially, the sessions were designed to gather information about German communications networks. But Sarah also paid close attention to how the women described what America. She noticed Ingrid's tone shifting. Though she answered carefully, the certainty of her early was gone. Instead, there was a quiet unease, an acknowledgement, even if unspoken, that Germany had miscalculated badly. The next morning brought fresh evidence of American might. The prisoners were marched past a section of Norfolk's vast aircraft maintenance facilities. What greeted them left even Ingrid speechless. Hangars the size of cathedrals stretched into the distance, each packed with dozens of aircraft in varying stages of service. Rows of bombers, fighters, and reconnaissance planes gleamed under the bright lights, mechanics swarming over them like ants. Technical Sergeant Michael O'Brien, who oversaw the maintenance floor, provided a casual tour. Speaking with matter-of-fact confidence, he explained how aircraft were cycled through repairs, how spare parts were always on hand, and how pilot training kept pace with production. His words, tossed out with no sense of exaggeration, hit the prisoners like sledgehammers. Replacement planes, he said, rolled off production lines faster than Germany could destroy them. Losses, even heavy ones, were seen not as setbacks but as routine costs of a war America was fully prepared to win. For Ingrid, who had coordinated communications with Luftwaffe units destined for fuel and spare parts, the sight was unbearable. She remembered frantic calls from air squad. She remembered mechanics stripping wrecked planes for salvage, improvising repairs with find. Now she stood inside a facility where abundance was so overwhelming that broken parts were simply discarded and placed. The German women exchanged glances, each realizing the Luftwaffe, once hailed as the sharpest blade of the Reich, had already been outclassed beyond repair. Dr. Crawford, making her medical rounds later that day, uncovered another layer of disparity. She reviewed the Germans' medical histories, listening as Ingrid explained recurring fatigue and illness among her unit due to lack of nutrition. With calm efficiency, Dr. Crawford handed over bottles of vitamins, explaining casually that such issues were entirely preventable with proper supplies. To the Germans, her nonchalant tone was crushing. What had become a crippling weakness for the Wehrmacht was here treated as nothing more than a minor inconvenience. By the end of their second day, Ingrid could no longer deny the truth gnawing at her mind. Every corner of Norfolk Naval Base's organization and planning that dwarfed Germany's capabilities. She sat on her bunk that night, staring at the ceiling, replaying the scenes. The shipyards, the convoys, the factories, the barracks, the food, the air, all of it pointed to a single conclusion she did not want to accept. Her homeland had misled her. Either German leadership had been catastrophically ignorant of, or they had deliberately concealed the truth from their own officers. Neither explanation gave her comfort. Both meant that everything she had believed about Germany's chances in the war were lapsing. For a woman trained to think in precise calculations, the numbers told their own story. If America could build ships by the dozens, produce planes faster than they could be shot down, and feed prisoners better than Germany fed soldiers, then the future of the war was not in. The only mystery left for Ingrid was how long it would take her homeland to accept it. By the third day, the German women were no longer simply shocked. They were unsettled to their core. The early impressions of abundance at Norfolk Naval Base had evolved into something far more powerful, a dawning realization that their homeland had gravely underestimated its enemy. What they were seeing was not propaganda, not a carefully staged show, but a daily reality of empower. For Ingrid, each new observation forced her to reevaluate everything she had believed. She had been raised in a system that glorified German technological superiority. Radio broadcasts and military briefings had painted America as disorganized and decadent. Yet now, walking the grounds of the base, she was living proof of the falsehood of those claims. The morning began with routine orientation. The women were escorted past administrative buildings where clerks managed streams of efficiency. Each office was fully equipped with telephones, typewriters, filing cabinets, and stacks of supplies. To an outsider, these details might seem mundane, but to trained officers like Ingrid, they told a chilling story. Germany's war machine had long been crippled by shortages, paper rationing, broken typewriters, missing telephones. Here, none of that seemed to exist. Ingrid's mind ran the numbers. If America could organize its vast armies with port, then German efforts to disrupt their logistics would never be enough. This was not a military fighting at the elapse. This was a nation fighting comfortably with resources to spare. Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell, ever observant, watched as the German women reacted to each new sight. She could almost read their thoughts in their faces. First disbelief, then dread. When she spoke with Ingrid later, she noticed subtle cracks in her composure. The once proud signals officer now spoke with measured caution, as though every word had to be weighed against a shifting reality she could no longer control. That afternoon, Ingrid was taken to the communications wing of the facility for a routine prisoner intake call. She was permitted to phone the International Cross, confirming her status and ensuring proper registration interventions. But the real impact came not from the call itself, it came from what she overheard. While waiting, she listened to the flow of American radio. Operators spoke casually about miles, references to troop movements in Europe, simultaneous actions in the Pacific, and ongoing supply missions to distant theaters filled the air. To Ingrid's trained ears, the implications were staggering. Germany had struggled to maintain communications even across its shrinking European front. Yet here was the United States, effortlessly directing campaigns on multiple continents as though distance were irrelevant. The very infrastructure, the cables, the radios, the codes, revealed a technological depth to match. Later, during her debriefing with Lieutenant Mitchell, Ingrid could not hide her unease. She admitted, almost reluctantly, that American communications surpassed even the most optimistic. She spoke in professional terms, analyzing what she had heard. But her voice carried something else too: fear. Meanwhile, Dr. Crawford continued her medical rounds. She treated the prisoners' fatigue and malnutrition with steady efficiency, dispensing vitamins, clean bandages, and proper care. To her, it was part of her duty. But to the Germans, each visit was another reminder of how fallen. When Ingrid mentioned the chronic weakness spreading through her division back home, Dr. Crawford responded by commonplace. Ingrid had no words. What her soldiers had suffered for months was here solved in minutes. The most devastating blow cangers. The Germans had already seen Norfolk's vast shipyards, but the scale of American air power was beyond comparison. Hundreds of planes, bombers, fighters, transports, the hangar floor and runways beyond. Mechanics worked in seamless teams, replacing engines, checking instruments, refueling tanks. Technical Sergeant Michael O'Brien explained the system casually. Planes cycled through constant maintenance, spare parts always available, replacements arriving regularly. He spoke with the detached tone of someone describing a routine process, not realizing that every word was crushing the spirits of the audience. For Ingrid, whose work had often put her in direct contact with Luftwaffe units run empty, the contrast was brutal. She remembered the desperation in pilots' voices begging for fuel, the frantic attempts to repair planes with scavenged scraps, the orders to conserve every bullet. Here in America, such desperation simply did not exist. That evening, during dinner in the mess hall, Ingrid found herself studying the food more than eating it. Fresh bread, thick stew, milk, fruit. It was more than German soldiers at the fronts. She thought of her comrades still fighting on the East Front, struggling with rations that barely kept them alive. And here she was, a prisoner eating like an officer. She whispered to Anna Kruger, seated beside her. If America feeds its captives like this, how much do they give their soldiers? Anna did not answer, but her silence was more telling than words. Lieutenant Mitchell noted these whispered exchanges carefully in her reports. She realized that the true intelligence value not only in what the Germans said about their own, but in how they reacted to America's abundance. Their expressions, their doubts, their private whispers, all revealed the slow erosion of faith in the Reich's propaganda. The final shock of the week came when the women were shown photographs captured by Allied flights. Ingrid was summoned for a briefing, where she was presented with aerial images of German industrial sites. She recognized them instantly: synthetic fuel plants, ball-bearing factories, railway hubs. But what left her pale and speechless was the extent of the destruction. Allied bombing had reduced vital facilities to rubble. Transportation arteries lay severed, factories gutted, fuel reserves obliterated. Ingrid knew propaganda back home had minimized the damage, insisting production continued unhindered. Now, staring at the photographs, she realized the truth. Germany's war machine was bleeding out, and no amount of willpower could save it. The photographs included one image that struck her most personally: her own former headquarters. The building lay in ruins, its communications wing flattened by precision strikes. She understood immediately what it meant. German codes had been compromised, their locations pinpointed with accuracy. American intelligence, she realized, had penetrated deeper than anyone inspected. When Lieutenant Mitchell asked for her assessment, Ingrid could only speak with grim honesty. German supply lines, she admitted, were collapsing. Fuel shortages were crippling operations. Communications were no longer secure. Resistance could continue, yes, but not victory. That night, lying bunk, Ingrid wrestled with despair. She had been trained to resist interrogation, to protect secrets, to uphold the Reich's cause. But now the truth was undeniable. Germany was not fighting a winnable war. It was fighting for survival against an limitless. For the first time since her capture, Ingrid felt the weight of hopelessness settle on her shoulders. The proud signals officer of Berlin was beginning to confront a thought she had once considered unthinkable: that the Reich she had sworn to serve might already be lost. By the fourth day, the German women no longer carried themselves with the same rigid discipline they had on arrival. Their shoulders sagged, their voices softened, and their silence grew heavier with each passing hour. The shock had given way to quiet resignation. No amount of training could shield them from the overwhelming surrounding them. For Ingrid, the change was most profound. She had once been the confident spokesperson of the group, delivering precise answers to Captain Hayes and Lieutenant Mitchell. Now she spoke more slowly, her gaze drifting toward the floor, as if she no longer wanted to meet anyone's eyes. The war inside her mind was becoming visible to everyone around her. The day began with another routine march base, but the route chosen by their escort team. The prisoners were led past supply depots stacked high with crates, food, uniforms, and gear. Forklifts and trucks moved constantly, transporting materials to ships waiting at the docks. The efficiency was relentless, the staggering. Ingrid could not help but compare it to the chaos she had left behind. In Germany, depots were nearly empty, supplies rationed with desperation. Officers spent more time fighting over allocations than directing operations. Here, the system worked like a well-oiled machine, delivering everything needed without hesitation. Anna Kruger muttered under her breath as they passed rows of canned goods. Enough food for an army. Enough to last years. Her voice was filled with awe, but also fear. Their next stop was the training field, where American recruits drilled under the watchful eyes of instructors. The discipline of the young soldiers was impressive, but what stunned the Germans most was the sheer line after line of fresh recruits filled the ground, their uniforms crisp, their movements sharp. These were not weary veterans clinging to survival. They were new soldiers, well-fed, well-equipped, deployed. For Ingrid, the implication was devastating. Germany's forces were dwindling, each new class of recruits younger and less prepared than the last. Here, America seemed capable of producing endless soldiers. She remembered the bitter words of a Luftwaffe, "We are bleeding, while they are only just beginning." At the time, she had dismissed it as pessimism. Now she knew it was truth. During the afternoon, the women were separated for interviews. Captain Hayes focused on technical details, radio frequencies, encryption methods, supply lines. Ingrid answered cautiously, revealing little beyond what she believed the Allies already knew. But even as she tried to resist, Hayes noticed her tone changing. There was no longer the defiance of a proud officer, only the weary resignation of someone who knew the inevitable. Lieutenant Mitchell, meanwhile, pursued a different strategy. She did not ask about codes or equipment. Instead, she asked about experiences, what it felt like to serve in the German forces, what daily life was like, how officers coped with shortages. At first, the women resisted, insisting they would not betray their comrades. But gradually, the dam began to crack. One prisoner, a young cryptographer named Marta Vogel, finally admitted that her unit had been forced to recycle radio parts for months. Another, a logistics specialist, confessed that she had been ordered to hide reports of fuel shortages to prevent panic among commanders. Each revelation confirmed what Allied intelligence already suspected. Germany was collapsing within. When Ingrid's turn came, Mitchell leaned forward with quiet intensity. "You're a professional," she said softly. "You've seen both sides now. Tell me, do you still believe Germany can win?" For a long moment, Ingrid said nothing. Her training screamed at her to remain silent. But the images of the past days flooded her mind. Rows of aircraft, overflowing depots, fresh recruits, endless supplies. At last, she spoke in a low voice. "Victory? No. Survival, perhaps, but not victory." Mitchell recorded the words carefully, knowing their significance. A crack had opened in the distance. That evening, the women were allowed a bodyguard. The sun was setting, painting the water in gold. But what drew their attention were the ship departure. Crews moved with practiced coordination, loading cargo, fueling tanks, checking weapons. It was a display of naval power seen. Ingrid counted ship after ship, her heart sinking with each one. She knew Germany no longer possessed fleets. The Kriegsmarine had been battered, its U-boats hunted, its surface ships sunk or trapped in port. Here, America seemed capable of launching an entire new navy when it wished. Anna, standing beside her, whispered, "How can anyone fight against this?" Ingrid had no answer. At night, back in the barracks, the prisoners lay awake in silence. Some stared at the ceiling, others at the floor. None spoke of hope, none spoke of home. The silence itself was a confession. For Ingrid, sleep did not come. She replayed the events of the day again and again, the warehouses, the recruits, the interviews, the ships. Each piece formed part of a puzzle. Germany was fighting a war that be won. In her mind, she tried to cling to duty, sworn, the comrades still in the field, the officers who depended on secrecy. But each time, the images of American abundance shattered her resolve. The Reich had promised victory through sacrifice, but here she saw victory born of resources. Sacrifice alone could never overcome it. As the lights went out and the base fell quiet, Ingrid whispered to herself in the darkness, "To us." The words hung in the air, unheard by her companions, but heavy with truth. The illusions that had sustained her through years of service were broken. For the first time, Ingrid allowed herself to imagine a future where Germany was not the victor, but the defeated. The fifth day at Norfolk Naval Base marked what had begun as shock on arrival had finally acceptance. The German women, once confident officers and specialists, understood that their homeland could not stand against the power witnessed. For Ingrid, the transformation was complete. She no longer carried herself with the rigid posture of an officer. Her shoulders drooped. Her eyes betrayed exhaustion not from lack of sleep but from the collapse of belief. She had come to America thinking herself a prisoner of war. Now she realized she was also a prisoner of truth, one that revealed the Reich's promises to be illusions. That morning, the women were escorted to. On the walls hung maps of the world, each marked with colored pins showing American military operations. Red lines traced supply routes across the Atlantic and Pacific. Blue markers indicated troop deployments in Europe, North Africa, and Asia. To an untrained eye, it might have looked like clutter. But to professionals like Ingrid, the meaning was terrifyingly clear. The United States was not merely fighting in one theater. It was waging a global war with coordination. Its fleets moved across oceans. Its planes dominated skies. Its armies advanced on multiple fronts at once. And every marker on the map represented resources, ships, fuel, men, equipment that Germany no longer possessed. Captain Hayes began the session with his usual calm authority. He explained, without exaggeration, how American industry was ships, planes, and tanks at a pace never before seen in history. He spoke of Liberty ships rolling off assemblies, of aircraft factories delivering squadrons faster than they could be deployed, of tank divisions forming faster than German forces destroy them. The women listened in silence, pale. Hayes was not boasting. His tone was matter-of-fact, almost clinical, and that made his words cut deeper. Then Lieutenant Mitchell addressed them. She did not lecture about nation. Instead, she spoke about people, how American soldiers trained with full rations, how their families at home lived, how the nation continued to thrive even while fighting oceans. She contrasted this with Germany, where cities lay in ruins and children huddled in shelters. Her words struck at the heart of the women's unspoken fears. They realized that the Reich had demanded endless sacrifice from its people, promising final victory. But here, in America, victory was being achieved without destroying the nation itself. Ingrid could no longer contain her thoughts. She raised her hand and, almost trembling, "If you have so much, if you can fight everywhere at once, why has Germany not already fallen?" Captain Hayes answered with calm honesty. "Because wars are not won in a day. But make no mistake, your leaders know what you have seen. They know the tide has turned. They just will not admit it to you." The words landed like a hammer blow. Ingrid lowered her hand, her heart pounding. In that moment, she knew that the Reich's leadership them all. Later that afternoon, the prisoners were shown newsreels. Footage of American factories, soldiers embarking for Europe, fleets launching across the Pacific. The images left no room for doubt. Smiling workers filled assembly lines. Ships slid into the water one after another, and aircraft squadrons soared into the sky in perfect formation. For Ingrid, the most painful realization was that this was not propaganda. This was reality, filmed openly, with confidence that the truth itself was America's weapon. Back in the barracks that evening, the women spoke quietly among themselves. For the first time, no one defended the Reich. Marta Vogel confessed that she feared for her younger brother front. Anna Kruger admitted she doubted Germany could lead their year. One by one, the women voiced the thoughts they had hidden. They were loyal soldiers, yes, but they knew the war was lost. Ingrid remained silent until the end. Finally, she whispered, "We were told America was weak, that it was clumsy, decadent, too soft for war. But we have seen the truth. And the truth is stronger than any lie." The room fell quiet. Each woman understood the weight of her words. They were prisoners of war, but more importantly, they were witnesses. Witnesses to the real homeland had tried so hard to conceal. That night, Ingrid lay awake but her thoughts were different. She no longer wrestled with doubt. She no longer clung to illusions. Instead, she thought of the future, Reich, the suffering yet to come, the reckoning that awaited Germany when the war was finally over. She thought, too, of her role in it all. She had served with pride, belief in the superiority of her cause. But now she realized that duty had been built on deception. The Reich had not led its people to victory, it had led them to destruction. As dawn broke over Norfolk the next morning, the German women prepared for underguard. But something had changed within them. The defiance was gone. The silence that hung between them was no longer just fear, it was acknowledgement. They had seen the truth, and the truth could not be unseen. For Ingrid Weber, the Weaver, but her belief in it was. She knew that when history looked back, it would not remember the lie in Berlin. It would remember the reality she had witnessed with her own eyes. That America's strength, built on industry, resources, and unity, had already sealed the fate of the Reich.